Oh. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, March 28, 2019 meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Roll call, please. Ms. Ellison.
Commissioner Fischer.
Here.
Commissioner Staunton.
Here.
Commissioner Brindle.
She's here.
Oh, sorry, here. Commissioner Anderson.
Here.
Chair Hovland.
Here. We have a form of meeting agenda in front of us this morning. Is there anyone who wishes to modify the meeting agenda? Manager Neal, anything there you want to
No, nothing to change right
amend,
now.
change? All right. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda as shown?
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion and second to approve the meeting agenda as shown. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Community comment. There's a lot of folks in the audience this morning. Is there anyone that wishes to address the HRA on a matter that is not otherwise on the agenda this morning? All right. The consent agenda has several items on it. Is there anyone on the HRA that wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? I wanted to remove the revised affordable housing policy, if that's okay. And then, so with B off the affordable housing policy, the affordable housing policy off the consent agenda, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved. Second.
Motion second to approve the consent agenda with the exception of the revised affordable housing policy. All those in favor of adopting the consent agenda with the exception of the revised affordable housing policy, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. The only question I had that I wanted to raise with my colleagues on the proposed amended City of Edina policy is the fee recommended at $125,000. We have been having it set at $100,000 per door, we call it. But
Right.
I've got some concerns about raising that amount to $125,000 as shown in the staff report.
Right, and I asked about that, and Manager Neal had it changed so that the staff
Okay.
memo now says it remains
All right.
the same.
Good.
In other words, it's unchanged from the previous 100,000.
Okay.
It was a typographical error from the previous memo.
Okay. Is the revised one on the dais here somewhere?
It is.
And
It's
the
in the
policy
packet.
itself was.
But they changed the packet?
Uh-huh.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So with that, I'll move the adoption of the revised affordable housing policy.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just a question, I think, just a clarification on the ownership, the affordable ownership table. And we're kind of relating this ownership table to the
It's on page
MHFA
3.
program. I'm on
Yep.
on the staff report here that references the ownership model and the limits that are included in it relate to the MHFA startup program. So that's a program for first-time home buyers. And I just to reconcile that a little bit, we've got 1 bedrooms at $250, 2 bedrooms at $300, 3 bedrooms at $350. Now the MHFA startup table is $328, which is the exception to that is established by the Edina Housing Foundation at $350. Now, $350 is the maximum allowed under the table, which would be for a 3-bedroom. So when I look to the future and say, are we using the MHFA guidelines as a consistent approach, or can there be exceptions, especially as it relates to senior housing or a senior cooperative if that were to be built? Because number one, the program is designed to keep the down payment and closing costs lower as a result of relieving MIP and then small low rate interest loans on the down payment and closing costs. So I just want to, rather than get lost in the weeds there, I just want to know that we are okay if there's a senior co-op that comes up, which is, I think, our best possibility for an affordable ownership option. If that were to come up, we're probably not going to build very many 3 bedrooms in a senior co-op. It'd be rare. I think you'll see the predominant of 1 to 2 bedrooms. And I just want to be sure that there's enough flexibility going forward in the tables that we're not limited simply to the MHFA or the 3-bedroom at $350. These could come in very easily at $300 or a little bit more, which under the MHFA program would be $328, and then under the EHFA limit, or I'm sorry, the EHF limit at $350. But the EHF limit isn't confined to, say, 3 bedrooms. So I just would like some clarity on that going forward.
Ms. Hawkinson? Thank you. Member Anderson.
Sure.
Good morning, Commissioners. There is flexibility with this. The limit with the 350 does align with the Come Home to Edina program, which is why it was changed in this table. When using the Come Home to Edina program, we do not look at the bedroom limits for that program.
Okay.
With regards to this, it hasn't been tested. We haven't done these type of ownership, so I think there's always the room for the flexibility.
Good. Okay. I just want to that's just as a point of clarity. Thank you.
Good. Anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I'll move the adoption of the revised affordable housing policy. Is there a second?
Second?
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. And now we are on to reports and recommendations. First matter that brings many of our neighbors over this morning is the Centennial Lakes Village Townhome Condominium Association park maintenance fees. And who's handling this matter from a staff standpoint? Manager Neal?
Thank you, Your Honor. I'll give an intro, and then we're here really to answer questions from council today. The city received a petition back in September of 2018 asking the city to consider discontinuing or amending somehow the Centennial Lakes maintenance fees that apply to the Village Homes HOA. And we've taken some time from a staff perspective to look at that issue, to examine the maintenance fees, how they fit into the greater fiscal system for managing the Centennial Lakes Park, and also doing a little bit of comparison to other HOAs and business associations around Centennial Lakes Park, so that we could advise the council on the advisability of granting this request or not. You may recall we had an initial public meeting at the HRA on this issue back in January, late January of 2019, just earlier this year. We took testimony from some of the neighbors and had discussion among the council. You had questions that evening, that morning, but we tabled the issue, and your request at that time was to Mr. Chair, was to bring it back to you when you had a full commission so you could have all 5 of you examine the issue. And it's just taken a while to get back to that where all 5 could be present. So we are here today to answer any questions that you may have about the issue. I think our staff recommendation to you on the issue is unchanged. We believe the best action for the city as a whole is to keep the maintenance fees in place, and we're here to answer any questions you may have. You asked questions about the affordable nature of the development. Ms. Hawkinson can answer some of those questions. Mr. Uram is here also to answer questions about the financial pieces of it, and Amy Schutt, who is an assistant city attorney, is also able to answer any questions from the legal perspective. So we're here to answer questions you have about this. The default condition is that the maintenance fees stay in place unless there is some kind of action by the HRA to change them.
Questions from commissioners? Commissioner Staunton?
So I had a few. I wasn't at the meeting in January, although I did have a chance to watch it, and it was very informative, but I just did want to cover a few things. One, perhaps for Ms. Shutt, I understood there was a conversation about this 30 versus 40 years and breaking it up. And my takeaway from it was that there was some question at the time as to whether a 40-year provision could be enforceable, and hence it was broken into two pieces. Have I got that right?
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners. Although my office was not the office that originally drafted this agreement, our assumption is that the agreement was drafted with a 30-year time limit and a 10-year renewal to comply with the statute on covenants. There's a question of whether this is a public covenant or a private covenant, but I think just to cover their bases, the attorneys who drafted this agreement drafted it so that it wouldn't be automatically eliminated by that statute.
Okay, thank you. And then a couple other questions that I did circulate to staff earlier. One was, and I don't know if it's Mr. Uram or the city manager, in terms of the fees that we generate from this and other projects, what proportion of the maintenance does the maintenance of the park do those fees cover for us?
Chair and members of the commission, so for Centennial Lakes, the HOA association fees for park maintenance pay approximately 30% of the overall operating expenses of the park. So it's about 30%.
I also noticed, I had a chance to look at one of the contracts. I understand they're all the same. And there is a provision in there that it permits the city to, it basically says this fee agreement doesn't in any way prevent the city from assessing those properties for benefits that may accrue to them from improvements that are made in the park. And the other question I have is whether we have done any such assessments since the agreements were put in place.
Chair, members of the commission, I had an opportunity to talk to Tom Shirley, who manages Centennial Lakes, and he has indicated that we have not assessed the association for any improvements to the park.
Okay. And then finally, one of the things I noticed as I was going through the agreement, or at least it's implied in the agreement, is that unlike the way we do tax increment financing today in the city, which generally is pay-as-you-go, where we ask the developer to front the fees and then the city doesn't have any risk because we just pay whatever increment shows up. In this project, the city actually borrowed the money up front and then paid itself back through the tax increment fees, putting us on the risk. Isn't that right?
That is correct. So back in the mid-'80s, there was a significant amount of tax increment debt that was issued and paid back over time.
Okay. And so had it not developed into the great place that it is today, the taxpayers of the city would have been on the hook for the difference.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Member Brindle, you had your light on there momentarily.
I did, but I turned it off.
Okay. Your question was answered?
It was.
All right. I want to go back, Ms. Shutt, to the one of the issues that was, I thought, persuasive for me in the last meeting was a conversation that you just had with Member Staunton about the covenant, public-private, the conclusions you reached from a legal standpoint about what was intended to occur at the beginning and what was actually done to make sure that we didn't run afoul of potential Minnesota statutes regarding public versus private covenants.
Sure. So I believe that the intent under all of these agreements that aren't in perpetuity was to have a 40-year time limit. You can see that in some of the other agreements that were drafted in 1988, which is a little bit earlier than the ones we're dealing with. Just have a flat 40-year time limit. But as I said, these agreements were drafted in steps as each area was being developed. So we have about 30 different agreements, and I think at some point the drafters of the agreements realized that this covenant provision might affect the ability to have the agreement last the entire 40-year time frame. So in order to get that 40-year time frame and not run afoul of potentially the covenant statute, eliminating it, they drafted it to comply with the covenant statute, which has a 30-year time frame, and then drafted a 10-year renewal on top of that.
Okay. And the 10-year renewal was not a mutually agreed upon 10-year renewal. It was a unilateral right to renew on the part of the city, which seems to make more sense to me with respect to the what you're trying to achieve under the statute, or the concerns you might have under that statute.
Correct. A lot of times when we're drafting agreements with a renewal period, we'll have sort of an opt-in renewal period where you have the ability to renew. These agreements with the 30-year time frame and the 10-year renewal period have an automatic renewal period where they will renew no matter what, unless 75% of the property owners and the HRA agree not to renew them.
Okay. That prompt any other questions? Member Fischer?
Yeah, I just want to follow up. Mr. Uram, you talked about, I thought I read somewhere, or maybe I was doing my own math, and thought it was around 40% is what the association fees were paying towards park maintenance. And you're saying 30, and either way, it's in the ballpark, but well, you look like you're going to clarify.
Yeah,
so
Commissioner Fischer. So the past couple of years, there's been some catch-up provisions with property owners for the last 6 years that they haven't paid. So Centennial Lakes in 2018 paid an additional $75,000, which went into the HOA. So that's a one-time charge. And back in 2016, Pinstripes paid a catch-up fee of over $100,000. So those two numbers kind of pushed kind of that percentage up into the 40% range. But looking forward, it's going to be in that, somewhere between 30 and 35.
Okay, that helps. And to clarify, when you were talking about whether it's 30 or 40, or depending on when you look at it in the timeline, it's not just the village homes at Centennial Lakes. It's that percentage is all of the entities that are paying in. Correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so this particular group is some portion of the 30%.
Yes.
All right, just want to clarify that. As long as you're up, I wanted to talk about your final recommendation, which is to continue to collect the park maintenance fees, but it's to move the Centennial Lakes into the general fund. Can you tell me why that would be part of this recommendation? How does that help us in the long run?
Sure. So our recommendation really is based on kind of the financial stability of Centennial Lakes. Centennial Lakes continues to lose money on an operating basis year over year. So annually, there's a transfer from the liquor operation in here to continue to support it, but it's not a break-even operation. Our recommendation really was based on kind of the financial stability piece, as well as we're just getting ready to enter into our next 2-year budget cycle. And it would be a perfect time to move it if we choose to move it. I think the next available time would be in the next 2-year budget cycle, so we can take into consideration in the overall planning.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Fischer, I think that particular decision isn't in front of the HRA today, but I think it's fair to say with Mr. Uram's recommendation that it is a recommendation we intend to make forward to you later in this budget season.
Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you. A couple of things. Director did a great job of detective work in getting to the number of what we would consider affordable housing units that are in the project there. And my read on that is that about 91% of the existing units fall into the guidelines of our owned affordable housing sector as indicated by our new affordable housing policy. So it's also, in taking a look at your further report, it looks to me like the enterprise aspects at Centennial Lakes are workable, that falls within a range, or expenses as it relates to rentals and uses and so on kind of fall within a range. So the issue is really the ongoing maintenance and operation of the facility, and we have a dramatic shortfall there. So I look at a 10-year extension and say, and this kind of reflects Commissioner Fischer's comments as well, what happens in the long haul? And so I do think, and even though it's not decided upon yet, it's wise to move this into the budget at that time. The rest of what I get here is that many of the homeowners are the original owners, and because of retirements and getting on in life, probably of lesser means in terms of income than what they had when they moved in. 91% is a lot, and I think that to me, it suggests that there should be some special consideration there of some kind, because we are making allowances on a consistent basis for affordable housing and looking to affordable housing owners. So here we are, and it seems to me that given that we have a timeline, regardless, we kick the can down the road a little bit, and then we're still in the same position in 10 years without at least the Village Homes contribution on the park maintenance. So, yeah, for me, I would like to see some middle arrangement. If we can find a way to begin to phase these things out for them before we convert, assuming that we convert this into the budget at that time. For instance, and we could draft a motion, or I'm willing to make a motion if that's in order, to say phase this out so that we might have this year at say 75%, next year at 50, then 25, as we move this into the general budget. And I think that would provide some relief to this group of owners who fall into the affordable housing range. And I also believe that socially that it reflects our movement as a council and as a city.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I want to try to put things into perspective. So there's a couple of things that we have looked at. The Coventry Homes project, as well as Edinburgh, their park maintenance fees are capped at $15 per unit per month. This is the only residential project that has the kind of the CPI inflationary increase. So from just a pure financial perspective, our calculations, if we cap this at $15 per month, we would be giving up approximately $50,000 a year, or $500,000 over the next 10 years. So if we eliminated the fee completely, it would be inconsistent with what we're doing with other properties, and we'd give up about $1 million. So that's kind of the financial aspects of it.
Were you able to detect historically the basis for the capping of the fee at Edinburgh versus the inflationary build into this particular fee?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, we were not able to determine why that was.
Okay.
We talked to some of the folks who were involved in the original transaction, and there's just no consistent story about how that happened.
Right. So what you've done over time is you've inflation adjusted the fee, the park maintenance fee, and this may be more for Ms. Hawkinson, but is there, with the inflationary adjustment on that fee, are these homes still in the affordable range, or are we just talking about home values here, or are you looking at the broader sort of burden, I'll call it, on the homeowners out there in determining affordability? Because it certainly seems to me like a fee, even though it has a potential finite life of another decade, it's still a part of the overall burden. So how do we look at that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, if I may. So when we looked at the affordability of the Centennial Lakes, all we did was look at the assessing data for each of the homes. So the estimated market value for Pay 19. We did not include any of the HOA fees or any other fees that they're paying. And I reported to Commissioner Brindle yesterday, there was a question about how the fees have increased over time. And according to one of the homeowners, when they initially purchased back approximately 22 years ago, the HOA fee was $180, and I believe it's currently $410. So it's gone up that much. From my perspective, that's not an unusual amount for a HOA fee.
Did you look at real wages in that same period of time, and that inflationary? You had the inflationary increase in the park dedication fee. What about real wages? The increase there, did they run in parallel?
Mr. Chair, we did not look at real wages.
Okay.
So we took our inflationary data specifically from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
All right.
So they're comparable metrics, but not exactly the same.
Yeah. What I'm interested in knowing is, this was all built as affordable housing, and there were fees that were determined to be appropriate and inflation adjusted, even though they knew it was affordable housing at the time. That would change over time. But of course, real wages change over time too. So I'm wondering if there's a net negative impact on people over time, because you've got an inflationary factor on the park dedication fee, but maybe real wages haven't risen to accommodate that expected change caused by inflation on the park dedication fee. That might be an interesting piece of data.
If it helps, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Fischer.
So last night I was taking this same, as I was trying to think through all this, I was taking this same line of thinking that I just went to the Consumer Price Index for Minneapolis-St. Paul over this period of time and tried to see how is this really tracking. And I know that, that's not exactly wage comparison. But the Consumer Price Index, let's see, I think I had it here, went up it was a 209% increase over that amount of time. And whereas this deal is about 187%. So if you were doing a graph, this rise has been lower than the Consumer Price Index, which made me feel a little better about it. That it's if indeed the council or the HRA back then acknowledged that this was going to be affordable housing, and they felt that number was okay in that scheme of things, then in theory it stayed below that mark.
Okay, good.
It's a very unscientific way to approach it. Sorry.
For my colleagues, one of the things we've talked about here is the potential impact on the residents of Coventry by continuing this fee for another decade, making that unilateral determination. But I think there's a flip side question too, and that is the fundamental fairness to the residents of the entire city of Edina to shift the 30% of the cost of maintaining that park to the entire city. When a bargain was struck back when this facility was created, when these buildings were created, that they would be affordable, but they would have an inflationary increase in the park dedication fee. And I think from Ms. Schutt's research and analysis from a legal standpoint, it's pretty clear that it was intended to last 40 years. So the only reason it was set up the way it was to make sure that we didn't run afoul of the state law and covenants, whether the public covenant law. So that's a conversation we really haven't had in terms of the shifting of that burden of 30% of the maintenance of the park. We know that's going to happen. If we renewed this, it's going to happen in 10 years, and I think Director Uram is saying, let's start planning for it. Let's start thinking about how we're going to shift over that responsibility. But when this bargain was struck 30 years ago and anticipated to be a 40-year bargain, at least that's my view of it, is it fair to shift it now, 10 years before it was intended to expire, over to the entire city? Or should we be doing something like what Commissioner Anderson suggests, phase it out over time, or should we just leave it in place for the next decade? And that's part of the conversation I'd like to have today. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I do. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to ask one more question of Mr. Uram, and maybe you said it and I just missed it. So we know there's an affordable component. There was always an affordable component in this particular, in the village homes. Is this the only component on Centennial Lakes that has that? Like, I mean, if we're talking about, we got Coventry, we've got Village Homes, and we've got Edinburgh, essentially.
Yep.
And commercial.
Well, and just leaving the commercial aside for now, just on the housing front, is this particular part of the only affordable, or would that, are there other areas?
Good question, Commissioner Fischer. I would argue that it's the only affordable piece.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Member Brindle.
So I've been giving this a lot of thought, and while this is the only affordable piece, they actually pay the most of all of the residential. So that, I'm having trouble weighing that and weighing the fairness of that.
When you say pay the most,
They
you
pay
mean in the park dedication
dollar for
fee?
dollar in the park fee, yeah. And I think in the beginning, it was, if the entire HOA fee in the beginning was $180, looking at proportionately, it was probably affordable at the time. But there's a crossover at some point where the percentage of increase became higher than Coventry, higher than the other residential properties that pay into the park fee. So looking at affordability, that's where it becomes less affordable than its peers. And so that's where I'm looking at this and saying, all right, if in fact the objective here is to keep it affordable, we've gone beyond that already if we define affordable at the cap of $15 a month per unit. And so that's my sticking point here. Looking at how Centennial Lake is used, and then you expand that out into how all of our parks are used. There are amenities that serve everyone in Edina. There are amenities that serve people outside of Edina. So it brings me to thinking about, that decision that we're not here to make today. And that is the recommendation to consider putting at least this portion, this 30% of this portion of the village homes of Centennial Lakes into the general fund, into the budget, where everyone in Edina, commercial and residential, pays a share to keep Centennial Lakes pristine and keep it supported. I don't know that there's a downside there. I think it's just looking at what is that next sustainable model to support Centennial Lakes. And we have a commitment to do that. We absolutely have a commitment to do that. Centennial Lakes, while it, the tax increment financing agreement at the time really took a big risk that today we wouldn't take. Today we don't take that kind of a risk in tax increment financing. It's too big a risk on the residents of Edina and the businesses of Edina. But at the time, the city was willing to take the risk because they had confidence that Centennial Lakes would become what it is. And we're lucky it did. This conversation would be very different if it hadn't. But getting, focusing on where my thoughts are at this point is really, can we really define this as affordable when Coventry units, which are valued much greater than the condominiums at Village Homes, pay much less in their HOA fee as their park fee as a percentage of their HOA. So I'm concerned about that, and I think 10 years we could, we could sundown it in 10 years the way it's set to be. But that doesn't address the fact that we are taking what we defined as affordable units and charging them more than their peer units.
How did you deal, Commissioner, with this notion of the inflationary build on the park dedication fees, that would, at least in theory, track real wages, and that over time, the effect today of paying $28 a month shouldn't be any different than the effect of paying whatever that was, $15 a month or $10 a month back when the facility was built?
Well,
one of the things I'm having difficulty with is it seems clear to me that this was intended to be a 40-year agreement.
Right.
And so we're looking at whether or not we want to not unilaterally renew this thing. Mm-hmm. And what are the fundamental issues that are in that decision? And,
well, the fundamental...
One is you've raised, and the other is on the flip side, what about the expectations of the city of Edina and all of its residents that in exchange for us taking all the risks when the park was built as a city, mm-hmm. We strike a 40-year deal with the developer on these affordable units, and certainly the fact that the fee would be have an inflationary adjusted factor was a part of the discussion about continued affordability. How do we reconcile that for the taxpayers who took the risk and thought we had a 40-year deal? In your mind, because I think you've thought about this pretty
I have
carefully.
Thought about it, and I guess I don't know why the same model wasn't applied to all the other residential units.
Yeah, I don't
So,
either. But it was applied to this one in terms of creating affordability.
Right, and I think maybe they just didn't think far enough to when it would become more expensive than the other units, and the other units then aren't affected by inflationary increases. So I guess I look at that as a fairness issue.
Yeah, you look at that as a fairness issue in the neighborhood.
Yep.
But what about the fairness issue relative to the rest of the city?
Well, I mean, if we pick up on a yearly basis, if we pick up the $83,000 that is currently collected in the park fee for the 250 units, 1% of our budget is $330,000. So 83,000 is what, a quarter of that? It's a quarter of a percent that we would then apply to a levy, a park levy, or looking at getting that from the general fund. I'm sorry, it's not a lot to have the city residents and businesses share in their property tax for Centennial Lakes. It's ultimately where this would go if this council accepts the recommendation. So this is a complex decision today, because on the one hand, looking at fairness of, if I live at Coventry Homes, I'm going to forever pay $15 to make sure that that park looks good. If I live in the Village Homes, I'm going to pay today $28 a month. Eventually, I'm going to pay, what have I got? I'm going to pay $33 a month. And then by the time I pay $33 a month, the program's over, because I'm at 40 years. Mm-hmm. So it's going to increase $6 over the next 10 years. Is that going to break the bank? No, it is not. But again, it's a fairness issue. These folks are paying almost twice what Coventry residents are paying. And that just strikes me as wrong.
So are you proposing to make it the same or to eliminate it altogether?
Well, one of my questions really is, what does the covenant look like at Coventry? What does the covenant look like at these other residential locations where they are paying the park fee? Are they on a 40-year? Is that going to sundown at 40 years?
The manager, Neil, you had a comment first, and then we go to...
Well, while
Ms. Shutt.
our attorney is looking up the answer to that question, I think from a staff perspective, we concede everything that Commissioner Brindle just said. It's a difficult issue. The amount of park fees from this particular HOA against our entire city budget, it doesn't break the bank by any means. Our concern really is the slippery slope argument, because there is, while this particular HOA isn't going to break the bank, there's enough maintenance fees sort of at risk here if we decide to make some decisions about this that we could put at risk. I mean, that it would be enough to notice, I think, for the general taxpayer, and I think that's our bigger concern.
Ms. Shutt.
So there are, let's see.
If she needs more time, I could.
Yeah.
There are 10 agreements in which the fee
Would
continues.
you say that again, Ms. Shutt?
There are 10 agreements in which the fee continues in perpetuity. And there are,
Does that include Coventry?
it looks like there are about 20 in which they are 40-year agreements. So the 40-year agreements are the Village Homes, condominiums, Crescent Townhomes, Centennial Lakes Plaza, the medical building, Pinstripes, the other commercial buildings that aren't circling Edinburgh Park. And then the fees in perpetuity are the condominiums directly north of Edinburgh Park and the commercial properties that circle Edinburgh Park.
Commissioner Fischer?
So I'm going to come back to Member Brindle's comments in a minute. But just overall, I think at the public hearing and all of the emails we've gotten, I think there have been a lot of compelling arguments. And I definitely, if I would have probably made a decision right after that public hearing, I would have probably been leaning exactly to what Mary's saying, that it just doesn't feel like there's equity between the Village Homes and Coventry and some of the others. And then I started taking this time to really think about this. And then I started trying to think about it from every angle, including, since that hearing, we've gone through a hearing on 7200, 7250. And I tried to put that filter on this, because the reality is, while this is a really compelling argument, and I think it's compelling because we look out here, these are our friends and neighbors, right? These aren't developers. They're just us. But when we're negotiating these deals on the front end, it's a developer sitting here, right? So every one of these deals was a deal struck with a developer, all in their own time, their own place, and their own conditions. And that's I was struggling with. It's like, well, why has Coventry got that deal and Edinburgh has this deal and the shops on the other side of the lake have a different deal? It's hard for us to know, but they all struck the deal for that time, for that place, that made sense. There was a give and take. And I think one of the things to really think about is the city was taking a risk on a lot of these. So the TIF was very different back then. The city was taking the risk. If this thing went south, it wouldn't have been, these homeowners taking that. It would have been the city. Well, they would have been in their portion, right? So I tried to think through this one step at a time. And so first of all, they were all individually negotiated. The city did take risk. And then I think about this in today's world, something we can all associate with. So let's go back to the 7200. Part of that deal is that there are townhomes. Well, there's 20% of that project is affordable, and there's this Woonerf, this public street. Except it's public in the sense that absolutely everyone gets to use that as a connector in the neighborhood. But that development is paying for it. So now imagine 10 years from now, the owners of the townhomes, which I think some are going to be affordable, on that Woonerf, are going to come to us and say, but it won't be the owners of the townhomes, it'll be the developer. Picture the developer coming to us and saying, hey, you know, we're paying for all this, and a lot of other people are using it, and it's different than a block here or a block there, so can we just redo this deal? How would that developer be received, right? I think there would be, you know, pitchforks and outrage in the streets. It's different here because the developer's not asking for this, it's the homeowners. But it's really the same because it's a deal, and the deal, you know, is the deal. In this case, I think the mistake is that, like today, I can't think of a deal that sunsets in anything that we have done in development projects, because if it's important to maintain something, it's going to be important forever. And so if there was a mistake, it was actually sunsetting some of these. And I'm going to come back to the equity piece, because I think there is still something there. But then I was looking at I did do the calculations on the consumer price index compared to this, and just really quickly taking the numbers that Director Uram gave us about just a sample homeowner association, you know, the escalation of that. My quick numbers based on what you just said are that, now you were saying it's 22 years back, so it doesn't go all the way back to the beginning of this, but even in those 22 years, the portion of the park maintenance that these homeowners are paying as a percentage of their homeowners association fees has gone up. Well, today it would be with the price they're paying today, which is $28 a month, represents 6.8% of their homeowners association fees. 22 years ago, it was 8.3%. So I can only imagine if you go back all the way, it was probably 9 to 10% of their homeowners association fees were for park maintenance. So over time, if you look at just and if they were affordable back then and they were paying this proportion of the association fees, their proportion today is smaller. So I'm just saying that if we're looking at the affordability component, in theory, it should be more affordable today, even at this higher price. So the other way I looked at this is this argument that, and it was a fair argument, the idea that, well, everyone uses this park, you know, everyone should participate in that. And that's true, but that's why this is just a proportion of the cost of maintaining the park. It's the 30% or the 40%, whichever that is. I remember so well when I was on the Planning Commission years ago, and the proposal, so where Pinstripes is today, the proposal for that was going to be a tower. You know, it was going to be a lot of housing with retail and other things on this park. And at the time, and I can't say that any one of these people were here, but there were a lot of people that lived on Centennial Lakes in all of the developments at those public hearings. And the thing I heard over and over and over again is if you add more people to this park, it affects us, not the rest of the city. And literally nobody said this has an impact around the city. So it was very much what you do on Centennial Lakes is about us, you know, about the people that live on it. And there's truth to that. But then it also, to me, holds true that there is that connectivity. So the benefit of keeping a great Centennial Lakes has more benefit to the people living on it than the rest of the city. So there actually, in my opinion, Mary, there should be some skin in the game for the folks that either live or the retailers or whatever on the lake. And frankly, had we done that project or a project with more housing density on the lake, it actually would be helping us today. We would have more revenue, not less. The other thing is we are continuing to invest and make this park better, and we're not assessing back to these property owners. And the bridges that are being built right now are a perfect example. that is a value-added feature, and I would like to think that if you live along that park, that is a real value as well. And yes, they're paying the maintenance fees, but they're not being asked to take on the burden of these newer expenses. So there's never been an assessment. I do, another factor that I look at is what is our staff recommending? And what I've learned about our staff is that they're fairly empathetic in issues. I get that from them, and in this case, I think they're looking at the full range of options and making this recommendation. So for me, I really came full circle on this in terms of what really is fair. Now, could I be convinced that there's a pathway between here and the next 10 years that says, we have a, maybe we stay where we're at and we don't let the inflationary, the increases happen, that we just flatline it for the next 10 years? I could look at something like that for sure. But I'm convinced that we have to respect the deals that were done and respect that there were reasons to do them, and then focus on that piece of it.
All right, thank you. Member Staunton, or Commissioner Staunton?
Well, so just to clarify, the $15 a month, there's some that go on in perpetuity.
That's correct.
But they're not at
It's
Centennial Lakes.
it's
those
largely
commercial?
commercial, but there is one residential development that includes a in perpetuity fee, and that is the condominiums that are directly to the north of Edinburgh Park.
Okay. Well, I mean,
So is that Coventry? Okay.
Chair, members of the no, that's
Not what I
Edinburgh.
heard.
So Coventry is Bicentennial Lakes.
It is the
I'm just trying to
70s.
figure out which multifamily housing building is right north of Edinburgh.
Correct.
That's not part of this group.
That's correct. That's Edinburgh.
Yeah.
It is the 7600s Edinburgh Way properties. I had them listed as Village Homes of Edinburgh condominium.
Okay.
well, so I guess the point is, I do think there was a bargain struck here, and part of if we change this, we're going to hear from every single other association as well. And the question for me is, has there been a change in circumstance? I mean, the agreement talks about how the park shall be a benefit to all the citizens of Edina, but shall be especially beneficial due to the proximity and ease of use and enjoyment to all owners and occupants of the land and project and all unit owners. And I don't think that's different today. I mean, I went over there and took a walk just yesterday, and clearly there's more benefit to being close to it than there is for folks who are further away. And given the negotiation at the time and the fact that we struck a bargain at the time, it seems to me that the bargain is what we ought to stick to. Now, I'm open to something that makes it equitable among the various different residential properties, if that's doable, but it strikes me as a treacherous territory, since we have some, the temptation is to change it to $15 a month per unit for everybody, but then we're going to give up one of the units that has $15 a month per unit in perpetuity instead of just 40 years. So I guess I'm open to being persuaded on a way to make it more equitable among all the residential properties. But to me, it strikes me as part of the bargain, as Mr. Mayor, you were describing, Mr. Chair. And, our job, I understand where the folks are coming from who are paying this, but our job is to look out for the whole city. And, we're kind of here as proxies, not just for the folks who live in this neighborhood, but also the folks in the rest of the city. And what's the responsible thing to do there? So.
Hey, I would cut a deal today that if the homeowners all agreed, we just switch from this escalating thing for the next 10 years to $15 in perpetuity. I mean, there are ways that...
They're paying 28 now.
Right.
You'd cut it back to 15?
In perpetuity, so we're not...
Well, in perpetuity.
Right. So I'm talking 30 years from now, there's still $15 a month. Now, obviously it's going to be worth a lot less, but there's a longer stream of something that then, as we're, trying to figure out our other funding sources, I don't know.
Could I ask Ms. Hawkinson a clarifying question? Is there anything about the inflationary factors that are either... Well, I want to just concentrate on the park dedication fee that they pay. Because the HOA, I think that's, everybody in an HOA realizes they got to maintain their property over time and those costs are going to go up. But is there anything about the fee being on an inflationary, using an inflationary factor that it has created a lack of affordability over there over time? In terms of how we define affordable housing.
Right. Chair, Commissioners, I quite honestly have not looked at the fees as a proportion of income. This is generally, not just at this site, this is generally a concern with condominiums and townhome type developments in affordability as frequently, and the fees over time make the project no longer affordable. This is why some organizations like Habitat for Humanity no longer build townhomes. They build side-by-sides because of the HOAs make them no longer affordable. So that's a general concern with these types of developments and long-term affordability. With this one, although the properties, 90% of the properties are assessed at the affordability levels, there is no evidence or research on the incomes of the current owners. There are conjectures that if they're original owners, then they had to qualify at the beginning, but we haven't looked into the current incomes of owners. Also, depending on the demographics.
So you're saying that existing owners may or may not qualify to be able to even buy the property if it was an
yeah, there's just no information on
we have
that.
No information.
The original owners had to be income qualified. How their incomes have changed over time, there's no evidence of that. But generally, the HOAs are problematic with affordable housing because of the costs and fees.
Okay, good. Thank you. Member Brindle?
A clarification that I would like is members of the audience were trying to answer a question, and I'm not sure it's the same question that we were talking about. So Edinburgh Village Homes, their park fee is in perpetuity, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Centennial Lakes Village Homes, their park fee is capped at 40 years. It sundowns at 40 years.
Correct. The ones we're
if
dealing
we
with
keep
today.
if we keep it on the schedule that it is, then in 10 years, the fee goes off of their books and comes onto ours.
Correct.
Okay. Looking at the other, let's see here, the covenants that are in perpetuity, the park fees that are in perpetuity are related to Edinburgh Park. Those park fees that are related to Centennial Lakes are all on a 40-year schedule. Is that fair to say?
I believe so. I don't have them split up in that way, but I believe that that is correct.
Okay, because I've got a list of like 10 different covenants here, and they're separated by Centennial Lakes and Edinburgh, and it seems in the discussion that that's how one is on a 40-year schedule maximum, and the other is in perpetuity. And it's related to which park they are adjacent to, whether it's Edinburgh or Centennial Lakes.
That appears to be
So,
correct.
All right, I just wanted that to be clarified, because the homes that were being discussed as being north of Edinburgh are the Edinburgh Village homes,
Correct.
not the Centennial Lakes Village homes.
Correct.
All right.
Manager Neal, you concur in that? You were
I do. We were just comparing, I think that Commissioner Brindle's looking at the same chart maybe that I am that was in your packet from January 31st.
Right.
And there's a graphic that summarizes the various phases and the different parameters around each long-term commitment.
Commissioner Staunton, were you done with your comments, or did, Commissioner Anderson, you had some thoughts early on that were interesting. And any follow-on to this conversation up here prompted any other thoughts you want to share with us?
Thank you. Just briefly, I agree with my colleagues in that the integrity of agreements is important, of course. And yet this is structured so that we can look at this time. And I do think there has been a change here. And when in terms of the units, the demographics in the village townhomes, and I look at the whole package, and it's hard for me to come off of the fairness of where we are today in terms of how other units around the lake have been as they contribute. The escalator, I think, is something to look at very carefully. I'm certainly wide open, as I suggested earlier, to finding a mechanism to provide some relief. One way or the other, this arrangement terminates, no matter what. And yes, we can look at 10 years down the road, but in the meantime, we have real people who have lived there for a long time, and we do have the ability at this time to look at it and say it wasn't structured as a 40-year agreement. It was structured as a 30-year agreement with a 10-year extension. So as I suggested earlier, there may be a phase-in. There may be some other way to approach it, open to that. But I do think it's time to take a look at the folks involved there.
Member Brindle? Commissioner, I should say.
It's okay. So I'm putting myself in the position of a resident and looking at what is included in the HOA fee, which was my initial question to Director Uram yesterday. Is I've never lived in a place that has an HOA fee, so I wanted to get some understanding of whether the HOA fee, when they get their annual budget, bill, whatever, does it break out where that HOA fee goes? And it doesn't. They just know what they need to pay per month. They don't know from that how much goes to snow plowing or lawn mowing or maintenance of the building or upkeep or whatever, and then park fee. And so the way we know the park fee is that we know what the city collects out of what that HOA collection is, which is currently $330 a year per unit. And when I break that out, it's $28 a month. Is there value to a village home, Centennial Lakes Village Homes resident to living on the park? It's probably the reason they like their location, is because it's on the park. Is that unit valued greater than it would be if it was not located on the park? It very well might be. We know that just looking at the broader Southdale area, that is very valuable property in our city. So Centennial Lakes is part of bolstering that value and keeping that property valuable. So there is value in being there. there's also value in being at the other locations, residential locations adjacent to the park. One thing that was brought forward in the public hearing, listening to residents, is the building upkeep that is going to be needed in the coming years. And I can only anticipate that the HOA fees are going to increase to be able to pay for the new roof, maybe the new siding, I don't know. And looking at the effect of that per resident at Centennial Lakes Village Homes. So that has me a little concerned as well, because the stuff that they have no control over, being able to put a cap on, and that is the condition of their building, is possibly going to cost them more and more in the coming 10 years to be able to maintain their building so that it doesn't deteriorate. So that I'm thinking about that as well. So where the park fee fits into that, I think that's relief that I am sensitive to, and I would be if I lived there. So,
Commissioner Staunton.
But that could be said of every property. Every property is going to have maintenance obligations, costs, maintain, expenses that are going to be incurred to keep the building in appropriate order. So I understand that, it's like anything. We just as soon not pay a fee. And so to me, the question is, it is a question of fairness, but it's also a question of what was the deal, and how is this fair to the rest of the residents of the community who are going to have to pick up the bill if these guys don't? And it's folks, when we did this back in 1991, it was a clear deal. And if I were sitting in these folks' chairs, I'd probably be advocating to sunset it now too. But I think we have to be thinking not only of them, but what about the rest of the community and what's fair to the rest of the community?
Well, as you could tell from my earlier comments, when we had the public hearing and we had Ms. Schutt here, the most compelling thing for me at the time was the fact that this was really intended to be a 40-year deal, but because of the way the law is structured, we had to be careful about a belt and suspenders kind of approach. So we had a 30-year period of time with a 10-year renewal on the part of the city. And I don't fault anybody for thinking that this is an opportunity to eliminate or cap a fee. I think it's a good argument, and folks got together and thought, well, this is the time to be thinking about this when the city is thinking about whether or not they're going to renew it for another 10 years. And I kind of get the argument that it's different than what other people have in the neighborhood, but to me that's not a very compelling reason. To me, what's important is that the entire city took a risk when the park was built. And you got buildings on zero setback to the park. You're right on the park, and it increases your property values. And it doesn't matter to me if you're right on the park, living there, looking over the putting green, or you're over on the other side of the building. You're right on the park, and there is benefit to that, as Commissioner Staunton said. The other thing that's been good to hear, I guess, is that over time there have been no special assessments put in place against the homeowners, which I think is a really good thing, and I think appropriate because of the fact that you're paying this fee. The compelling reason to eliminate or cap the park fee for the next 10 years would be to keep these units affordable. I think that's probably the main argument that I've heard. But the problem is we don't have any income data on the residents to determine whether those that are living there right now are even qualified for affordable housing based on our existing policy. There might be people in there that have lived, some of the people that testified have been there over 25 years, and I'm assuming some are employed, some are retired. This is really a tough issue to deal with from an affordability standpoint because we just don't know. We knew the original residents were income qualified. That's why this building was built. And I'm assuming that when this building was built, people that wanted it built for affordability purposes were also thinking about what are we going to do with respect to the costs on park maintenance in the future and make sure we keep these affordable. So even with that, I mean, I'm assuming with that thought in mind, they said, yeah, okay, we can have an inflationary factor here because it shouldn't really impact people over time because the real wages should track along with it. And I thought that was a nice piece of data that Commissioner Fischer put together. I'm open to the idea of thinking about capping the park fee over the next 10 years, figuring out some kind of methodology that makes some sense. But I'm really bothered by the fact that we don't have any income data on the residents to determine whether they are income qualified based on our existing policy. To determine, if that would help me decide whether this is really an affordable housing issue or whether it's something else. But you can't get past the primary notion, at least for me, that this was a deal that was intended to last for 40 years. And it was a deal that was struck with these particular developers. It was this was housing created to provide affordability, as I understand from talking to folks, and I think some of the people were on a walk a few months ago with Bob Coteen, who said this was built to keep young people in town. None of us are young people anymore.
So apparently they all stayed.
Yeah,
That's
they
great.
did. A lot of them stayed, which is wonderful. Do we need to make a decision this morning? I mean, do we need, because I would listen to some arguments about, for me, not eliminating the fee, but maybe capping it or eliminating the inflationary factor. To me, I'm not persuaded by the fact that somebody else pays 15 in perpetuity, or they pay 15 and it's going to end in 40 years. This was a deal that was struck with this particular developer on an affordable housing project at the time. And I think we've got that, to me, we've got that responsibility with respect to the rest of the residents in our town who took enormous risk by front-ending all the costs for this particular project, thinking that it would be a success. Fortunately, it was, and they didn't end up taking the burden on it. But that was the quid pro quo to me, was that we'll take the front-end risk, spread it across the whole city, but in return for that, here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay these fees for 40 years.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, the extension is going into effect, right? So the default condition of this for this HOA agreement is that it extends unless you take an action to amend it or stop it. So it will go forward without an action. You asked if you have to make a decision today. I would say you're not under any obligation to make a decision today. However, I think it's worth noting that their original petition was submitted in September of last year. So
that's what we're making a decision on whether or not to deny this petition.
Right. So I would tell you,
that doesn't preclude us from making a decision.
There's not even an action you need to take to deny the petition. The action would be if one of you wants to make an adjustment to the HOA fee, you'd have to propose that in that form and get a majority vote.
Okay, but the staff request is that there be a motion denying the petition submitted by the homeowners of the village homes at the Centennial Lakes. So I think that is a matter we have to deal with. And then if we subsequently want to deal with the idea of capping, eliminating the inflationary factor, reducing the period from 10 to something less than 10, that's a conversation we can still have.
Right.
And it seems like the commissioners are interested in that notion. Some may be just interested in eliminating the fee right now. I just, I get some sense of that from a couple of our colleagues. So, well, let's deal with this petition first. And is there a motion to deny the petition submitted by the homeowners of village homes at Centennial Lakes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, let's have some discussion on that.
So just to clarify, the petition is actually to eliminate, we'd go from 28 to 0. That's essentially the petition.
Director Uram?
That's correct. They've asked that we eliminate the park maintenance fee.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Any further discussion on that issue? Okay. All those in favor of the motion denying the petition submitted by the homeowners of Village Homes at Centennial Lake, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Carried. 3-2 vote. Commissioner Anderson, Commissioner Brindle voting against. All right. What about a conversation with respect to something less than the 10-year term that's inherent in the automatic renewal or a reduction or cap in fees? Are people interested in talking about that at some point in the future?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're all interested in that. I mean, that's the sense I got from everybody here is, but again, I would just reiterate that for me, I think it is important, as Member Anderson said, or Commissioner Anderson said, to try to keep these affordable. So I'd like to know about the impact of the fees, not the HOA fee so much as the park dedication fee. And I know that they have a cumulative sort of effect on people. But the HOA fee, as Commissioner Staunton points out, is something inherent in every multifamily ownership situation. They all have to deal with that regardless. So I'm wondering about, and then I'm also wondering about the affordability component. You know, I know some people are on fixed incomes and some probably are still working. And we have a real sensitivity on this council, I think, across the board on this HRA to affordable housing issues, and we want to make sure that things stay affordable. But as Commissioner Staunton said, we got a broad responsibility here to the entire city. We've got to do what's best for the entire town.
I think that affordability and keeping these units affordable is a bigger question than we can answer today. Because when we look at affordable housing, it's in the deed of that property that it's going to remain affordable for a period of time, and that the sale of that property or the rent of that property is dependent upon the person who comes in to purchase or rent that piece of property, that dwelling, has to prove their income qualification according to the average median income. I don't know if this was done at the time or how it was done at the time, but I guess I'd like to look at how these mortgages were entered into in the first place. Were they intended to get people into them at an affordable price, if you will? And did that have any intent on remaining affordable? Or was that just initially to get people in them, make them available at an affordable rate when they were new, with no intent of keeping them affordable for the next sale and the next sale of that unit? So if there is knowledge of that, I guess I'd like to know if it is part of.
And I don't know if this is the question you're asking. The question that I'd be interested in is, are there any restrictions on the price at which these units can be sold?
Yeah, that's really the question.
There are.
Chair, Commissioners, the initial buyer, from the documents that we could find, the initial buyers needed to be income qualified, and the units were set at affordable prices. And that's when the Edina Housing Foundation was able to provide a second mortgage to make sure that they're affordable. We could not find anything that stated that subsequent buyers needed to be income qualified or that there are any restrictions placed on the sale price of the properties. So it's for the initial buyers only.
Okay. So they're not required to remain affordable. Now they're at market value. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
But still 91% affordable even at market value, which is a good thing. Yeah. So they are in that NOAA category. All right, so I think we've got some other work to do. I've got to meet with the city attorney at 9:30, so we should keep forging ahead. So Manager Neal, Director Neal, would you think about setting up some kind of a work session for the HRA?
Yep.
So that we can discuss how we want to deal with this issue of the fee, but for right now, we'll deny the petition. The petition is denied, and we'll figure out what we can do.
Very good.
Okay.
We'll calendar it for you.
Just to be
Commissioner.
clear, we have shifted our conversation from changing a negotiated deal from 30 years ago that we denied. We are now on a conversation about naturally occurring affordable housing and how we might, as an HRA, support that. To me, that's a very important distinction
Right.
in this conversation today. Because this isn't about changing deals around Centennial Lakes. You know, those are deals.
It's a critical
This is about
distinction.
now naturally occurring affordable
Yeah.
housing, and, you know, if we decide there's something we should or could do for this particular development.
Right. That's a great way to phrase it.
Good point.
Benefits the next owner, not this one.
Okay. All right. Thanks, folks, for the good discussion. Thanks for everybody for coming this morning, and thanks for your input over time. Mr. Neuendorf.
Yes, good morning. The second item on the agenda is a discussion, not looking for any specific action this morning, but the conversation you just finished is a great introduction and prelude to this. The City of Edina last updated its TIF policy in 2011. The policy has been our guidance since that time. It's effective, it works, but there's always questions that come up, and as the city's seen so much redevelopment in the last few years, there's been a fair amount of confusion amongst some members of the community about what TIF is, how it works, how does the city and the HRA intend to use it. So in order to make sure that we're always on top of our game and making sure that we're looking out for that community good, it's our recommendation that we consider updates to that TIF policy. And staff recommends taking advantage and embracing our new community engagement system, that Better Together Edina system. In order to make sure that we look at the best practice and make sure that our policy meets the current needs and the future needs, we're recommending that we look at other communities to see what they do, look into best practice. This morning, we'd really appreciate any direction, concerns, questions that you all have. But then over the next couple months, we'd like to reach out to the community at large using that Better Together Edina system and get other input from the community and use that whole collection of information to provide a draft policy for your consideration later this summer. In your packet, there was a public participation proposal regarding the community engagement effort that I just described. And so far in our review of about 10 or so different communities and their policies, we'd recommend an outline that might look something like what's in the packet and on the screen. I think we can always make sure that we describe the purpose and the scope of using TIF or any other public financial incentive. I think most important to the community is looking at the outcomes, though. What's the public benefit? What's the risk? What's the acceptable level of risk? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? So some of these topics are outlined here in what's on screen. The outcomes, the area of focus, the process. That's always something that I think we can. Over the last couple of years, I think we've learned we can make a couple improvements there. And then when it comes to guidelines for establishing new TIF districts or using current TIF districts, from time to time, the topic of property tax abatement comes up. That's something that we've talked about in the past, but we have, to my knowledge, we've never used it in Edina. That might be something that we might want to consider. So the questions that I would love to hear from you all today on is, what are some of the concerns and preferences that you have? Over the last couple years, there's been a lot of conversations, a lot of projects. I know staff has prepared a frequently asked questions type of presentation that we've included whenever we present on TIF. We present that to the council, the HRA. We also presented to other groups that want more information. But this morning, I'd really appreciate hearing any other tips or questions that you have that we might consider as we put together a draft for a new and updated policy.
Commissioner Staunton?
So, when I think about the TIF projects, the applications that we get, there's kind of three categories that I think about. One is the statutory but-for test. Is there an establishment of that, which is really a threshold item? The second point is, what is the risk for the city? And then the third point is, what's in it for us as a community? On the risk, really, it's two parts. One is this notion of pay-go as opposed to bonding up front. It was just the conversation we just had about historically we might have been willing to, as a city and as taxpayers, borrow money, finance a project, and then pay ourselves back. What we have transitioned to is this notion that a developer who wants to propose a project and is looking for TIF assistance needs to upfront that funding, and then we will give them a note saying to the extent increment comes in, we'll pay it back. So that's part of the risk. The other part of the risk that is in Mr. Neuendorf, all of your presentations, is the percentage of our tax capacity that is tied up in TIF projects or TIF districts. And I think it's important that we keep an eye on that. I don't know what the right level is necessarily, but I think in evaluating each one, we ought to be cognizant of whether we're putting too much into tax increment financing or not. And there'll be a lot of variables that'll be part of that conversation, but we ought to be considering that. So that's the risk side. In the what's in it for us side, there's a lot of different ways, and I'd be very curious to hear what folks in the community have to say about what's in it for us. I mean, one of the recent projects we had, the 7200, 7250 project, which I guess is still going on because we haven't decided actually on the actual assistance side of it. But we've gone through a 3-year project to re-envision what the greater Southdale area is going to look like. And that involves a lot of encouragement for private property developers to change the way they configure their property going forward. And to me, that is something that is in it for us, that we can't necessarily make someone do, but if they're willing to do it, can we partner with them to make those things possible when you already have a built-out environment? So those are the three things, the but-for, the risk, and the what's in it for us that I want to make sure we hear from folks on. And as we consider whether to change the policy, that we make sure we're clear on those things. Thanks.
Commissioner Fischer?
I think you hit on 80% of what I would want to make sure that we have in a policy, and some of it's already there. But and before so I think the what's in it for us component, in my ideal world, when we're having these conversations at HRA and council meetings about TIF project, we're always talking about what's the public good, so what's in it for us. But I want to make sure that's a central focus of that conversation. And I think Commissioner Staunton articulated that pretty well. But I think a part of that, and I'm still not totally sure if this is a feasible thing to do, but is to say, look, if there's this amount of public good, and we're going to finance it through TIF, through this mechanism, what are the other alternatives? Can we demonstrate just going out and taking a general obligation bond and doing what we want to do? Is there a way that could be part of our process? And I would like to just explore that. So that would be one thing as we're looking at all of this. My concern, I think this is a great idea to go out and have this conversation with the public. My concern going into this is that there's so much confusion about TIF right from the get-go that the feedback we get back, we have to consider the fact that people are coming at this from a certain perspective. And no matter how hard we try, because we try hard just even in our conversations up here But when you put this out, on a this survey platform, there's no way to explain what it really is. So we just know we're going to get a lot of feedback that's about, stop giving handouts to greedy corporate, whatever. And so we have to somehow be able to ideally give enough information so people can really give the great feedback, but also have a filter so we understand, that where some of that might be coming from. And that's going to be tricky, but I think it's really important to get out and get as good a feedback as we can get.
Okay, good. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Anderson?
Thank you. When I first looked at this, I thought this has got to be day 3 of a retreat session. This is a big topic, but the conclusion I rapidly came to is you presumably have found and have the documentation for best practices around, and that would be really useful in gaining those, our executive summary of them, our documentation to that in terms of looking forward and moving forward. I agree with Commissioner Staunton that we need to be careful about not letting the genie out of the bottle, in the sense that if we are not cautious about what we do and weigh each application very, very carefully, if we're not taking into consideration who our partners really are going to be walking down the road, that's the balance has to be found there. So I just think caution is the way that's my view on it, but I also recognize that it's the single tool that we have available given application to certain projects, and it's a good tool. It's used all over the country in one format or the other. I did take a look at the statutes, Minnesota statutes. We've got a lot of room there to operate. And I looked also at our current policy, which was prepared at Manager Neal's request in 2011, and the Minneapolis policy, which is about double in size of ours. And I'm guessing that there's other policies in place that are significantly wider and larger. One more comment on the cautionary approach is, it seems like the bigger the policy, the more confusion that can be created in it. And so I'm not sure if 2 pages is the answer or whether it's 4, but I'm pretty sure it's not 8 or 10. Thank you.
All right. Commissioner Brindle.
Thank you. So I have a couple of things that I want to contribute. The first is policy for use of public finance incentives. I want to remove the word incentives, because they aren't incentives. It's the outcome of this is the ability to partner with the city to the degree that public good is enhanced with public financing. So I want to get rid of the word incentives. I think that is just going to be this. You might as well put it in red, because everybody's going to read it in red. And so I would just say public finance, policy for use of public financing, and make it as simple as that. And I would like, knowing that every deal is different, as we just discussed, and how different those deals can be, to ultimately come to the same conclusion. But why would tax increment financing be something that, while someone might come forward for it, why would we grant it? We would grant it to enhance public good. We would grant it, and these are just ideas, the access to affordable housing. We would grant it if significant public parking were part of that project, that it solves a problem like stormwater management, like safer pedestrian access to and from jobs to amenities, to medical, to transportation, to transit, to non-motorized connections. So there's a whole host of reasons why we would consider becoming part of a project. And there are a lot of reasons why we wouldn't, if it doesn't include significant public good. If it is a private project that, while it provides jobs and it provides services that are useful, needed, et cetera, it's a private business that can afford to put its building there and open its doors and do business for the benefit of all, that's great. But our dollars don't need to go into that unless there's public realm as part of that project. So I would frame the policy as what public realm, what areas of public realm are being addressed by this project to give us an idea of the degree to which tax increment financing then is triggered by that project. Then, looking through the districts, I'd like to see housing district included there. We've just created a housing district, 7200 and 7250 France. So whether it's a situation of NOAA, where we're looking at an existing building and want to preserve it, maintain it as affordable housing, or whether it is something that's being redeveloped as new housing, having a housing district and thereby being able to have that project qualify for affordable housing tax increment financing. So making sure that that folds in here as well. So those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Okay, good. Thank you, colleagues. A couple of language nits first here on your document, which I think is a good start. I think Member Brindle made a good point right off the bat about incentives. In that language on project decision, the third paragraph down, in your first section, you see that? Mm-hmm. I don't think it says decide on. I think it's whether there should be changes.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Okay? I'd delete decide on and interlineate whether there should be changes. And then down in the next section under your Roman numeral 1 paragraph, the first paragraph, in scope elements, you have that last sentence, TIF is a public financial tool available to municipalities and governed by municipal statutes. I think you should you should continue that sentence, and it should say for the purpose of, as Member Brindle points out, creating public benefit. Figure out some way to explain why it exists generally. And then to Member Fischer's point, I think it's really important because this is such a complex topic, and you're going out on Better Together to get comments. So to me, there's got to be some kind of backgrounding information at the beginning, some kind of education piece as to when we use it. And then also, Commissioner Brindle touched on this as well, the different kinds of TIF. Like think of 7200, 7250. Some of the folks that testified thought that this TIF district, the proposed TIF housing district, was subject to the Blight test. So, you've got to be able to explain, I think, to people that there's, that's distinct from the one we did at 44th in France. And just, so I think the different kinds of TIF districts that can be created and the different tests that apply, all of this creates, I suppose, more content, but at least theoretically should help people understand before they make comments a little bit more about TIF. So, and I thought the other comments by my colleagues were very, very good. Both Commissioners Fischer and Staunton about but-for risk and what's in it for us. Particularly, I think, emphasizing, why we use the tool, what's in it for us historically, what are the things that we were able to accomplish. So this is tricky territory, I think, when you're just going to do it online. And I don't know how best to set it up, but you've got some ideas from us now on things that are concerns to us and things that you should add to what you've already done here, which is a very worthy effort, I think. Anything else that caused anybody else to have any further supplemental comment? All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any correspondence other than what we had in the dais? Commissioner comments? Anyone have any? All right. Executive.
Just the only
Commissioner?
thing, the most important part of today, it's opening day. Hope springs eternal.
Yeah. I don't
Right,
see your, I don't
right
see
on
your
the first
cap.
base line.
All right. Executive Director comments. You got a couple of things you wanted to make us aware of.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just two very quick things, actually. First one is the go-ahead letter. We have received the go-ahead letter from Ted Carlson representing the Orion 4500 France LLC, which is kind of the official act that he needs to take to tell us that he's really going to do his project. So it means his financing is in place, and he's moving forward with the plan as approved by the HRA and the City Council. So that's good.
Good.
Second thing.
Speaking of that, what do you know about Guitar Center?
Nothing new.
Okay.
We were
I
asking.
thought they were going to start in the spring.
Yep.
I just haven't heard anything. I thought
Yeah.
maybe staff knew something.
We're asking that question too,
Okay.
but nothing to report on that. No go-ahead letter from Tom Lund. The other item was regarding 4435 Park Lawn Avenue. This is just I think a heads up to the HRA that staff is beginning to see and hear activity, real estate activity in this part of town where we have a considerable amount of naturally occurring affordable housing, rental housing. As you know, there's a number of buildings in that Park Lawn neighborhood, none of which were built any later than 1977, I think. This building is from 1965, but this one's on the market. We know another one that's adjacent to it that's on the market. We know that from what we're hearing from real estate channels that some of the people looking at these buildings don't have any plan to keep them affordable. So we have we're investigating this. We're trying to put together some ideas of how perhaps the city could get involved somehow, and we'll be bringing that to you as we continue to kind of develop these ideas.
All right. Very good. Any further comments from commissioners? All right. I'd say a content-rich meeting this morning on that one particular topic, and appreciate everybody's input and thoughtfulness on that matter. So we stand adjourned.